Okay, good morning. My name is Han Kuya, and I'm a senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. And I serve as Korea's trade minister up to May 2022. So we are going to talk about the U.S.-China geopolitical competition and its impact around the world, and in particular, Korea. And so we are extremely privileged to have this world-renowned expert and gurus on this topic. The first to my left, Michael Beckley, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and holds a PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. Michael is also non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's a co-author of the book Danger Zone: The Coming Conflict with China with Hell Brand, published in 2022. I think he is also known to have coined the term kind of peak China. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. And to the left, Sir Robin has Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford and is Distinguished Fellow of Chatham House and had led Chatham House as Director and Chief Executive for 15 years. He's also Senior Advisor at the Global Advisory Firm, Hakuluk. Yeah, Hakuluk. He's the author of the new book, The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the US and China Will Shape Our Century in 2024. So first, I will talk about, we'll ask some big questions about this overall kind of big picture strategy landscape. First, I will ask the two panelists. We tend to be preoccupied with a microscope view of what is happening now in terms of this U.S.-China competition. But let's look beyond the horizon with some sort of telescope view. And what would the landscape of this U.S.-China, the hegemon competition look like 5 years from now on, and then 30 years from now on? So first, Michael.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and to all of you for coming. I think in 5 years, that'll be the moment of maximum danger between the United States and China, simply because China is going pedal to the metal right now in terms of beefing up its military, so it's engaged in the largest military buildup in peacetime since Nazi Germany, churning out warships and ammunition. You see this escalating crisis with Taiwan, the aggression in the South China Sea. China probably in 5 years will also be, at least hopefully for China, reaping some of the gains of these major investments in emerging and strategic technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology. And at the same time, China in 5 years, I think, can still hope to have some allies that are fighting against the broader West at the same time. So I don't know what's going to happen in the war in Ukraine, but 5 years, Putin's Russia may still be a major actor on the international scene. We'll see what Iran does. But if the question, if you're asking 20, 30 years from now, I think by then the hegemonic competition is over. I think China may still be a great power in 20 or 30 years, but I don't think it's going to be able to make a bid for superpower status by that point. I mean, one reason is Xi Jinping is going to be 101 years old in 30 years, and so presumably he won't be as sharp as he's been right now with brilliant ideas like zero COVID lockdowns. But I think the one thing we know about 30 years from now, because pretty much everything else is unknown, is the demographics. And 30 years from now, China's going to lose 200 million working age adults. It's going to gain 150 million senior citizens. 1 out of every 3 Chinese citizens is going to be over the age of 65. So under those conditions, it's just very hard to continue to amass military power, engage in a superpower competition. The US demographically is going to add 60 to 70 million people. China's going to lose at least 300 million people. So at minimum, you've got a 360 million person swing at the same time that China's population is aging. And so I think these two things are related. The reason I'm so worried about conflict with China right now is there are these long-term structural trends that are moving against Beijing. We know that Chinese analysts are aware of these. They write about them all the time. And so that just puts much more pressure on decisive action on Beijing's part now to try to reset some of these trends. And unfortunately, I think it's pushing China in a much more aggressive direction in the short term.
I think that's very interesting. Actually, last week I was in China and I had some opportunity to interact with some of the leading opinion leaders. And I think, Chinese leading class, they think that time is on China's side. So maybe for the next 5 years or so, China will, go through some tough time. But we have to be patient because 30 years down the road, time will be on China's side. But what do you think, Sir Robin?
Thanks very much, and a pleasure to be back at the World Knowledge Forum, and great to have an opportunity to discuss this topic on this panel. What do I think? Are the next 5 years the moment of maximum danger? I'm just thinking about Michael's comments there. I think they are moments of intensifying competition. I don't see any improvement in the China-US relationship. My sense is rather than sort of plateauing, as some analysts have described it since the Xi-Biden summit last November in San Francisco, things have been continue to get worse. It is a structural competition that's based not just on geopolitical rivalry, but also on deep ideological differences. I think I would share Michael's view of the growing insecurity within China's leadership about China's own future, and insecurity, especially in authoritarian governments, can lead to an externalization of that internal insecurity. At the same time, of course, as Xi Jinping famously said to Vladimir Putin about a year ago, they feel the tide of history geopolitically is in their favor, that there is a frustration with US leadership, that the United States is overplaying its hegemonic hand with the use of the dollar and sanctions, while not having as an open approach to its own market, a more America-first approach, at least to trade policy. And so my sense is I may not be as confident about the 30 years' time of China's complete relative decline to the US. I think a lot of that relies on whether the US retains a leadership role, whether the United States remains in 30 years' time the leader of a renewed transatlantic and trans-Pacific set of alliances, which it has become since 2022 and Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. If Russia hadn't done its full-scale invasion, it wouldn't really probably have forced China to commit to Russia the way it has. It would not have connected Iran and North Korea with Russia and China the way they have been. So it has clarified some of the divisions between the two sides. It's led to a coming together of America and its allies. But if I'm looking 30 years ahead, the question is whether America can sustain that sense of leadership, given that historically it's tended to turn inwards and not apply that kind of level of confidence. So near term, I see an intensification of the rivalry, more blockism, and in 30 years' time, I can see a sort of bifurcated world, in essence, certainly in terms of technology. And if America can hold its alliances together, then I think the future for the liberal democracies actually is quite strong.
Okay, good. Before we move on to this economic issue, I want to, Michael, follow with your, the take on Taiwan issue. I mean, about 3 weeks ago, I visited Taiwan, and then I was struck by this history that I didn't know before, which is that before the Korean War, looks like the U.S. Approach towards Taiwan was more hands-off, was hesitant to, defend Taiwan. But after the Korean War, U.S. kind of reversed its course, and then they had this mutual defense treaty. So it looks like historically as well, this Taiwan is really interlinked to Korean Peninsula. So you mentioned you are worried about what's going to happen in Taiwan for the next 5 years or so. But if it happened, how that could affect the Korean Peninsula?
Well, it's interesting because, in the 1950s, you're right. I mean, the Korean War really explains a lot of the American alliance system today. I mean, the bilateral set of alliances basically almost didn't exist prior to the war. NATO was just a sheet of paper, so it was that aggression from the North into South Korea that suddenly galvanized and triggered the Cold War. The alliance with Taiwan actually emerged because the Chinese started launching artillery shells and bombarding Taiwan because they were afraid that the Taiwanese were going to sign an alliance with the United States, which then they duly did right after this started. So it shows you the kind of perverse implications of that aggression. I think, with Taiwan, look, if there's a war over Taiwan, it's not going to stay in Taiwan. It's going to spread and sprawl simply because that's what happens in these great power wars. And we're even seeing it in something like the war in Ukraine, where you get more desperate, you expand the range of targets, you increase the geographic theaters. Now, whether this means direct action anywhere near the Korean Peninsula, I don't know, but certainly the sea lanes that South Korea depends on, those are going to become shooting galleries if there's a massive war over Taiwan. The only scenario I could possibly think of where that doesn't occur is if China just refrains from any kind of strikes on US forces, say on Okinawa, in this attempt to sort of isolate Taiwan and just hope that an American administration decides not to intervene. But I just think the United States is going to intervene at the end of the day. And I think the Chinese know that, and they probably will launch those strikes from the beginning, at which point all of these sea lanes that South Korea depends on are going to be a total war zone. And how that ultimately plays out, I think, is anyone's guess.
Okay. All right, let's move on to this economic issue. I think there are many Korean the companies participating in today's forum. So I think there's all this talk about de-risking, and decoupling and bifurcation, etc. So how do you see this ongoing U.S.-China competition is affecting the supply chain in the region and globally? So Robin, you want to go first? Yeah.
Well, I think we're on a slow path in one direction, and there's a kind of ratchet effect to what's going on. Each time something happens, it creates a new floor from which you ratchet to the next level. So if I'm looking to the future, I don't think there's anything original in saying that the famous Jake Sullivan small yard with a high fence, or small garden, as we call it in the UK, with a high fence, trying to limit the technology areas in which pure decoupling takes. The idea that this could be limited just to sort of quantum computing, AI, semiconductors, is already proving a fallacy. If Chinese companies can get around some of the AI restrictions and use US cloud computing and access to cloud computing capability to run models, then you're going to have to find a way to start to exclude Chinese companies from the cloud computing capability. Where does bioengineering and biotechnology start? And some of the very high-end technologies, the Europeans themselves have started to identify biotechnology as an area of deep strategic competition with China. So, President Biden himself has talked about electric vehicles and the kind of high-quality sensor capabilities they now carry now, the kind of avionics of new cars, as being an area of security competition. So I see a kind of gradual expansion of areas where there will be actual decoupling taking place between the United States and China. And inevitably, to the extent that the United States does that, then its closest security allies are obliged, in a way, to follow suit. They're obliged partly because otherwise America might do what President Trump did to Britain on Huawei, where Boris Johnson wanted to keep Huawei in the UK 5G infrastructure system, but in the end had to back down. But China itself, I think, is going to say, we don't want to be dependent on technology from countries that are US allies that might come under sanctions pressure in the future to follow the American model if there were an escalation around Taiwan or the South China Sea or over human rights or whatever. So I think China itself drives some of the separation for its own hedging strategy, which, by the way, it started before we started de-risking with Made in China 2025 and dual circulation. I think the Chinese Communist Party had a much longer vision of the inevitability of competition with the United States and Europe than we did. So my last comment on this maybe is I think there's a sort of a bifurcation that is going to happen, a sort of duplication of satellite systems, duplication of undersea cables, duplication of all sorts of technologies, which make for a more inefficient world at one level, but does give a lot of opportunities for all these countries across the global south that don't want to pick sides. And as long as there isn't a hot war, maybe don't have to pick sides, to play one side off the other. So you could be oblique at one level, yeah, because certainly for South Korea, a country that's an ally, or the UK, our choices are more constrained. But if you're India, or if you're one of the Gulf states, or parts of Latin America, all sorts of new opportunities emerge.
Michael?
Yeah, I agree with everything Sir Robin said. The only thing I would add is, this is why I think talk about deglobalization is premature and probably wrong, because the human need or desire to trade and shuck and barter is just so powerful and overwhelming. And I think some people, when we call it a new Cold War, we assume that it's going to be similar to the other Cold War, but the original Cold War, the only reason you had major deglobalization is because of the communist bloc's predilection to just wall themselves off from private markets. But China obviously is not like that. So what you'll see is, as Sir Robin has eloquently sketched out, is this constant game of whack-a-mole of trying to de-risk here, de-risk there, and then providing opportunities for other countries to serve as sort of the middle facilitators of this new, more convoluted, less efficient, but ultimately still globalized economy.
Right. Yes, so next I want to ask about the technology, this nationalism or, tech competition. I think, previously Korea and China had a perfect kind of division of a role in the supply chain. Korea is taking more higher end, and then China is a assembly or lower end. But I think that is changing now. Now in many of these industrial sectors, China really caught up with this Korean technology, or even surpassed in some of these technologies, like I think autonomous vehicle, EV, batteries, etc. And so with all these the small yard high fence, the U.S. export control measures, I think there are two schools of thought. One is that so it will really contain China's technological rise, but the other school of thought is that this is sort of a Chinese Sputnik, moment, that it really galvanized the Chinese to really make all-out effort to really achieve this technology independence. So how do you see this among these two schools of thought? Michael? Yeah.
So I think what Sir Robin said earlier is exactly correct. China was not waiting around saying, as long as the Americans don't, put any export controls on us, I guess we won't try to push for technological primacy. I mean, they announced, 2004, they had a meeting where they were, even despite their 10+% economic growth rate, all these Chinese officials, I remember in Beijing, were so gloomy because they felt like they were just becoming cogs in a Western-dominated economy with these supply chains. And so this then ultimately leads to something like Made in China 2025. So China is going to push full speed ahead on trying to achieve technological primacy regardless of what the United States does. My colleague Chris Miller at Tufts, I think he's shown quite persuasively that some of these export controls can make differences in critical areas. So for example, China is still really struggling with lithography. And so if you're able to prevent China from being able to develop the machines and the broader ecosystem to do that, then it's going to significantly slow its ability to achieve the high end in semiconductors. I don't think it's it's not going to solve every single problem in the supply chain, but I think given that China is going to be going full speed ahead, if you want to engage in this in a competitive manner, you have to both, as you're running, kind of throw some things to make them trip, and ultimately, more importantly, run faster than China.
Mm-hmm. So, Robbie?
Yeah, I like that image of trying to run ahead and knocking the furniture over behind you as you go to try and keep that advantage. It's interesting because in the long term, I think America has innate strengths that should keep it ahead of China. And I don't know quite how to interpret it. If I look at the ASPE Critical Technologies Tracker that somebody pointed my attention to before coming here for this World Knowledge Forum, some remarkable statistics about the turnaround in Chinese leadership, now up to 57 out of 64 top technologies, according to their data. They're now leading in, including several in which you would have expected the United States to have had the lead. We leave things to the market on the US and European side. But as Michael was just indicating, China's had a long-term plan, and long-term investment into critical technologies really pays off. And if you look at some of the data of the heavy levels of investment in hypersonic missile capability, in undersea sensors and tracking that the Chinese are investing in now, way ahead of the combined US, UK, Europe, Australia kind of investments, it's worrying for the future. So my sense is that when you try to restrict technology from a country like China, with its huge levels of human talent, very high education levels, captive, massive market, and a very Darwinian capitalist approach to competition amongst startup companies, it's going to be very hard to confidently stay ahead. However, just on a note of, I suppose, optimism, at least from my standpoint, if I look at, we talk about America maybe having lost some of its bubble, but we haven't yet seen the full impacts of the more controlling impact of Xi Jinping, the favoring again of state-owned enterprises, the crackdown on the capacity of business people to really feel that entrepreneurial opportunity, a lot of wealthy Chinese leaving the country, trying to get their money out. I still would put my money on the innovative instinct and capabilities of more open market and transparent market systems than China over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think let's spend a bit time on this electric vehicle, because electric vehicle is really hot topic, in terms of this geopolitics right now. I witnessed, the status of EV, development in China. It was really staggering. I visited the Xiaomi factory in Beijing. They announced to launch EV in 2021, and then in 2024 they began to really churn out this kind of fancy-looking this EV. So it's only 3 years. It took only 3 years from kind of a planning to really go into full-scale production. And then I think it reminds us of this Apple. From a decade ago, Apple prepared for kind of entering into EV market, but for whatever reason, they failed or decided not to. So it looks like this is a current status of EV, competitiveness of China. And in Korea, this electric bus, the market share, China is over 50%. And then I think these Chinese EV makers, they're trying to enter into Korea and Japanese markets. So I think can US or EU or Korea or other country can catch up with this the Chinese EV industry, and how can we do that? Yeah.
I'll give a chance for Michael to think of a good answer. It's unfair otherwise for him to have to take the question every time first. It's going to be incredibly difficult, I think, to catch up well. Like you, I was in China in July and June this year, and again last year, and I used to go, once or twice a year prior to COVID. The difference between 2019 and 2023, when I was there last summer, and again a month or two ago now, is just remarkable. Remarkable. It's not just the amount of EVs in the Chinese market; it's the quality of the designs. This time, a couple of months ago, was the first time I felt that European cars in China looked to me like American cars looked to me compared to European cars when I used to live in Washington. It was just slightly old-fashioned, sort of Oldsmobile-y kind of Chevy look. I'm afraid I'm saying that. Sorry if there's any representatives of those companies in the room. But Europeans had a kind of look and a flair to the design. When I was in Beijing, the coolest-looking cars were the Chinese design. Of course, they've hired and paid a lot of money to European designers to give them a design. And then they've got the battery technology. Importantly, they've invested in the supply chains, the processing, cheaper price, massive domestic market, subsidized purchases, if not always subsidized production, but subsidized one way or the other. And then thinking of cars as kind of self-driving computers, electronic entertainment centers, whereas in Germany you're still thinking about Vorsprung durch Technik, the beautiful purr of the engine and the 6 valves or whatever. That is just a different approach. So I think we're struggling. And if the Europeans are struggling, America's probably going to struggle as well on this front. Also given the sort of geopolitical, almost and political competition over green being bad in some Republican circles and green being good in some Democratic circles. So yeah, it's going to be a tough journey. However, as I said a minute ago, just so I don't contradict myself, cars are jobs. If you're a democracy, you need to keep the jobs. So yeah, Europe is imposing tariffs, as is America, and we will do that, and we will be justified in doing it, just as China's been justified in protecting its own market. So it's going to be an area of competition, and it will force, I think, Chinese companies to invest. The question is, will they be allowed to invest in America? I think they will be allowed to invest in Europe.
Yeah. And Michael?
That's all I would add is simply, I think on the production side, I don't know how you catch that. And it shows the power of just unlimited funding and subsidies that can go in, that can take something. I mean, this is China's strength, is taking technology, making it better, and then mass producing it. But you have to factor in the reaction. And as far as I can tell, it seems like it's an extremely high likelihood that you're going to see massive tariffs coming from both the United States and the EU. And given the consumption, the relatively low consumption we're still seeing in China today, China may have the production capabilities, but doesn't have the markets that it can sell into. And you're already seeing, you know, all these statistics about excess capacity in this area. So I agree with you on the technology side. I drive a Kia, frankly, just I want people to know that. So it's a beautiful car, love it. Not these stodgy American vehicles, but when it comes to China, they have the goods in this area. It's just a question of whether they get access to the markets.
Okay. I guess many U.S. and European, companies may, try to, seek for your advice on how to strategize, their operations in China. So, I mean, Michael, how these U.S. companies are really coping with this changing environment in China? Do you have any kind of sense?
It of course varies very much by industry. I think people that are still investing in T-shirts and toys don't necessarily have to have their China plus one strategy. But I've been struck. I always know that the world is going in a bad direction when financial types start asking me to give talks at their places, and I've been struck by how many have been asking political science nerds and world politics people to come out and explain what's going on geopolitically. And I've been really struck about the very pessimistic sense about the geopolitical risk and the political risk that's expanding in China, and just the difficulty of managing your far-flung operations when you have to worry that you're going to have to spend multiple weeks in a hotel room or something, or just to go check in on it. So I think it depends very much on the industry, and in the strategic industries, I always advise companies, you may get squeezed on both sides, because China, as Sir Robin has pointed out, is actively moving to try to increase its own self-reliance and wean itself off of foreign producers. And at the same time, the United States, if you go to, I live close to DC, and all the talk on Capitol Hill is this ratcheting up effect that Sir Robin had mentioned, talking about denying China, revoking any kind of MFN status and making sure that things are subject to tight export and investment controls. So you could be squeezed on both ends, so you at least need this China plus one strategy if you're in anything remotely strategic, and you really have to worry that China just you've seen Xi Jinping's regime just wipe out entire industries overnight. So I don't know, if I were an investor, I would not be pouring my money there.
So Robin, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Michael, it depends on the industry. I suppose it depends on the reliance on the market. Clearly, the other half of China plus one is the China for China part. And certainly there are a lot of European countries. It's noticeable German investment in China has increased significantly this year. But it really is about partnerships within the Chinese market to access China. You become vulnerable politically. I think even the German government is going to sort of say to a lot of these companies, okay, well, if you're investing in China for China, you're investing in Chinese jobs, you're paying more and more taxes in China, where you're going to get less protection from us. But if you're a corporate leader, in the end, all of that money is aggregated and your salaries are paid based on the overall profit level. They don't sit and say, well, we'll pay you X amount of a bonus for your profit in China and X amount of your bonus for your profit in Europe. It kind of tends to get aggregated. So inevitably, companies are going to try and ride the tiger, to not coined the phrase, and it would be China for China remains an attractive proposition for many companies, and that's fair enough. Obviously, the plus one bit, whether it's in Vietnam, Malaysia, ASEAN countries, or others, often involves Chinese suppliers into your plus one, because the Chinese suppliers still have massive advantages in the cost of components, the speed of supply, etc. And I think, again, that's where, at the moment, again, depending on what sector you're in, governments will probably let you get away with it for the moment, even if you're producing in Vietnam with some Chinese components to sell, let's say, back into the US market. But there's one bit of data I saw about a year ago on the amount of impounded apparel, clothing, imported in the United States that have been impounded on the back of this wonderfully named, I'm going to get this wrong, Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, UFLPA, yes, the Xinjiang to stop from human rights there. And the bulk, over 90% of those impounded products had come from ASEAN, not from China. So the US is able to track already, if it wants to, what the sources are. And again, if things go wrong, if things tighten, then your plus one strategy has to be very clean. And if it's not clean without Chinese components, again, it's a risk for the future.
Okay, so let's move on to this Korea issue. What Korea should do? I mean, it's a very, very tough question. But so Korea has been the traditionally U.S. ally, this mutual defense treaty ally, but also the China has been Korea's number one trading partner for a couple of decades. So I think Korea doesn't want to take sides. Although I mean Korea strongly share this same value and this same like mind the partnership with other the U.S. and European Union. But now things are changing. This supply chain and trade patterns are really kind of shifting in Korea. So you are kind of this outside expert looking at Korea from more objective point of view. So let's say if you meet these key policymakers in Korea and then advise, how Korea should position itself in this, kind of very, very complicated U.S.-China, strategic competition, what would you say, Michael?
Well, first of all, I try not to give advice to governments where I don't pay taxes. I just feel like it's not appropriate. And second of all, I'm clearly not an unbiased source here. The American in me just wants to say, throw in your entire lot with the United States and divorce from China and marry the United States, but that obviously would not be good advice for Korea. I mean, you should always try to play both sides. But I guess the point I would make is, Korea, of course, you want to rely on the American security guarantee. That's crucial. But the China market obviously is going to be vital long term, and geography just means inevitably your trade is going to gravitate towards China. I would actually like you at some point to help elucidate, because I think you've been tracking the trade flows and showing this reorientation away from China towards Korea. And in my own research, I think if it's a long-term play, right now the economic benefits of commerce with China are potentially going down because of the slowing growth, because of the increased mercantilism and trying to replace foreign producers. South Korea's exports to China dropped by, 20% in the previous year, and I don't know if that's ever going to get restored. So the economic benefits are going down. Meanwhile, I think longer term, the economic benefits of commerce with the US will increase in relative terms for just simple reasons. I mean, the US consumer market will grow relative to China's, just given the demographics. The technology that the United States has, even despite all of the areas of excellence in China, still, half of profits in high-tech industries are generated by American firms, so you want access to those, plus the broader Western technology networks with Taiwan and other nations that you want to make sure that you're a part of. So the economic benefits of commerce with the United States, I think, will continue to grow, and then the security benefits seem like they could really spike, because it's funny that in the United States, North Korea gets paged like 13 news. I think if there weren't a massive war in Europe and chaos in the Middle East and China, it would be front page news, but it's clearly not going in a great direction. And then with China potentially having aggression in Taiwan or the South China Sea, it just seems like this would be a bad time to lean to China's side, especially given that its economy is just doing not so great right now. So,
So, Rob.
Yeah, I agree with Michael. I mean, I think South Korea cannot position itself vis-a-vis China. It is positioned. It is structural. There is limited room for maneuver for any South Korean government, given its reliance on the United States for its security, and given the geopolitical context becoming worse, and in my opinion, not likely to get better for as far forward as I can see, for the reasons we discussed earlier. So, just to say very quickly, we've got limited time, South Korea should aim for de-risking rather than decoupling as much as possible. Do China for China where it can and where it makes sense, and obviously think about where it can have China invested or Chinese companies invested in South Korea. So again, a bit like Europe, it ends up without those levels of dependence. But you talked a minute ago about geography, you know, and the gravitational impact of geography on economic relations. Southeast Asia is going through very high levels of pretty consistent economic growth at the moment, partly on the back of Chinese companies going into that market. But that creates big opportunities for South Korean companies who can help those Southeast Asian markets not become dominated by Chinese investors. And that fits into the geopolitical goals that you're trying to do. India obviously is one that the Japanese companies are already focused on. I know South Korean companies are as well. The partnership with Japan, and Japan is a difficult country to invest in, as we know. I mean, Europeans, Americans, anyone. But Japan is being forced to open up a little bit more than it was before. And at least geopolitically, it's a more favorable environment than it was a few years ago. In the US, the Biden administration at least has invested a lot in that. And last point I'd make is South Korea is in a position to be a reliable partner to Europe on the green energy and technology transitions that we want to do. It's a more expensive partner than China, but it is a more geopolitically reliable partner, and it offers things that American companies do not offer. So I think there's a big play for South Korean companies in Europe, and you should be competing heavily with China on that.
Okay. I think time is up. This has been really fascinating, excellent discussion. And I think also, Michael, you have a Korean book. Could you show this Korean book? You know, yes. I encourage you to join this event at 11 and 11:30 for this excellent, you know, this world-renowned report. So expert. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please.